Hi everyone, my name is Bailey Bryan, and for today's second video discussion, I chose the Methodist denomination. I grew up in the Evangelical Friends Church, and I'm still a practicing member. I do have an uncle that is a Methodist minister, but I really was unfamiliar with the early beginnings and really what that movement represented to a lot of Americans and why it was so popular. So, early beginnings begin with John and Charles Wesley. They were both members of the Church of England. They served as missionaries to Georgia in 1736, but they returned to England a couple years later, really discouraged with their results. And then in 1738, both brothers underwent what they referred to as a religious experience. And due to this religious experience, they began the early Methodist movement. According to the United Methodist Church, John Wesley's goal for this movement was to reform the nation, particularly the church, and to spread scriptural holiness throughout the land. Now, the early movement in America was not organized at all. It wasn't a formal push by the Methodists in England. It was actually due to lay Methodists arriving that were immigrating. And so they kind of just began to preach and to teach. And as the movement grew and more people got involved, John Wesley recognized that there needed to be a more formal movement that needed to emerge. I think the most interesting part of the Methodist movement was how it resonated with many Americans, especially post-Revolutionary War. According to G. Ward Hubbs in his article of Circuit Riders and Camp Meetings, Missionaries, and Methodists, he argues that a lot of the teachings of John Wesley and Methodism really resonated with a lot of Americans. It was this teaching of choice and freedom to choose your salvation, as opposed to the Calvinist teachings of predestination, where you're either destined for hell or for heaven and you have no choice. It was this teaching of freedom and a teaching of choice for your salvation. And that seemed to resonate with a lot of Americans, especially post-Revolutionary War. Another thing that he says is it was a theology of equality, and it was this idea of freedom. Freedom was optimistic. It was this idea of choice, and that resonated with a lot of Americans. Another important and unique feature about the Methodist Church was the use of lay ministers. It was everyday people being able to step up to the pulpit and teach the Word of God. It wasn't strictly college-educated ministers anymore. It was the everyday folk. And I think you see that a lot with the circuit riders. And they were teaching to the frontier where a lot of people didn't get to have a formal minister. But these everyday people were able to step into this role and provide a service to a lot of people that didn't get to experience a formal minister most of the time. Another really interesting article on this was called The Puzzle of American Methodism by Nathan O. Hatch. He argues that Methodism really represented social mobility for a lot of Americans because it was lay ministers and not these formally educated people. It allowed people to experience things that they wouldn't be able to before. He said the movement really represented this dignity of choice. It invited them to be able to choose, and it also allowed them the dignity of being able to serve in these roles that they might not have been able to in another denomination. They were able to step into these roles as ministers, circuit riders, class leaders, and to be able to kind of change themselves in a way that they might not be able to before. He also says that lay preachers represented this powerful symbol of the wall between these gentlemen, college-age ministers, and everyday people really falling. It wasn't there anymore. And I think that's what the legacy of Methodism was for a lot of people and why it caused such a skyrocketing growth. It was because it resonated with everyday people, and it reflected the important ideals of many Americans post-Revolutionary War. Francis Asbury, who was a major figure in the movement, said he wanted it to be a faith of the people. And I think that's why it was so important. It was a faith of the people. It was a faith that allowed everyday people to step up in a new way. So thank you.